it's all there. Okay, please go ahead. Jacqueline, you're still muted.
Sorry, I'm having trouble managing my, 1 second. I'm getting there.
We saw the screen.
I know. Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Good. Let me do this.
You can go to full screen mode.
Okay. All right, great. So I will continue in the direction of biology, and I will go even deeper into the brain and talk to you about single neuron recordings. And I'm very much interested in the same questions of information demand and curiosity and uncertainty that we've been discussing all along. In my lab, we take the position that we have a system, a cognitive system that is pretty much dedicated to information seeking, and that is the system of attention, which we study most productively with eye movements in the visual domain. And because this is such a fundamental system, I believe that perhaps it's a microcosm in which to understand the fundamentals of information demand all the way at the neural level, also because we understand the neural basis of visual attention pretty well. So I would like to start by giving just an overview of how we think about attention, and particularly to say that there's a missing question that we have ignored about the way in which attention is related to behavior. And this is exactly where information demand comes in. And then I will talk about the mechanisms of these two important forces that guide attention, uncertainty, and rewards. Okay, so we all know that decisions in any sort of realistic situation require attention. So this is sort of a schematic from a recent paper, just to show you the standard decision architectures that we consider in neuroscience. So we usually have a layer of sensory inputs. They are mapped on some action decisions or categories, here A and B. Those compete through some mechanism. They output a single action. There's a reward, and the mapping between stimuli and actions gets refined by reward-dependent plasticity. So this is just our the blueprint for many of the models we have today. And of course, we recognize, so in the laboratory, we really simplify the situation, give animals 1 or 2 stimuli, 9 stimuli, like here is really an exception. But we recognize that because the real world has an infinite number of inputs, really practically infinite, we need an attentional mechanism to constrain and make this work with a physical agent. The limitation, however, is that in the way that we think, in the way that we set up our experiments, and the way that we write our decision models and theories, attention is exogenously controlled. So in the laboratory, if you're a subject in one of our experiments, you'd have an experimenter tell you, attend to this or attend to that. And this really shapes our thinking about everything in this field. So we think if we have evidence that you're attending to the stimulus that I instructed you to attend to, we say that's top-down attention. If we think you're distracted by other things, we call that bottom-up attention. This is all relative to this exogenous instruction. Of course, this is not what happens in the real world. And in the real world, we have the situation. The animals are placed in some situation, they have some constraints, they have some behavioral goals, and there must be some feedback from the situation that endogenously instructs them to what to attend, right? So attention must be optimized through some loop, just like action selection is optimized through reward-dependent plasticity. We also have to understand how attention is optimized through some mechanism in order to best serve a behavioral situation. So this is the main challenge, I believe, in understanding attention control right now. So we must close the loop. Okay, so to do that, how are we going to go about doing that? Well, we need some sort of hypothesis to get us started. And then we need to devise some empirical method that's simple enough and powerful enough to get to test hypothesis. The hypothesis is actually out there. And that is Bayesian reasoning under uncertainty. So if we think that what attention does, despite all the debates about selective attention, I think we agree on its core role, which is to focus on sources of information. And in a decision theoretic perspective, information is a reduction of uncertainty, and therefore it follows that an optimal attention controller should be one that minimizes uncertainty. I should say here, so in this symposium, of course, as you know, there are many, just defining uncertainty has a lot of complexities to it, and there are many forms of uncertainty. In everything I will talk about and in the way we think about it, uncertainty is very, we think about uncertainty in a very narrow sense, and that is based on a known probability distribution. And everything I'll talk about is really a binary distribution, reward or no reward, action A or action B, the uncertainty over two alternatives. Okay, and of course the Bayesian framework tells us that a strategy to minimize uncertainty should be sensitive to two factors. So that is the prior uncertainty and the likelihood or validity of the observations that one can obtain. And this is a very fundamental formula, and there have been studies in neuroscience and psychology that ask whether people update their beliefs consistent with Bayesian integration. And we also know something about where the correlates of the prior and likelihood may be in the brain. But all of this, but none of this work has been applied to the attention system. So all this work on Bayesian integration has used a task in which people are given information. Again, information is exogenous. So we say, okay, here's a prior and here's a signal. I'm going to see how you update your beliefs given the signal. What we need to do in extending into attention is to understand how the brain makes the proactive decision. So a situation in which the brain has too many signals and has to decide in advance which one to observe or discriminate in order to minimize the posterior uncertainty. Okay, so how are we going to do that? So we have a hypothesis, we have a specific question, and now we need a method, a simple method to test it. So as I mentioned before, a traditional decision task would use a condition like this, where the participant is given a signal. So for example, let's say moving stimuli, moving towards the upper dot or the lower dot that indicate which alternative is correct. And then the participant would make a decision and experience a reward, right? So we start from given information. And what we do in order to move to that proactive aspect of it, we simply introduce an antecedent stage here in which we do not give our participants, in this case, there'll be monkeys, we do not give them the motion up front, but we ask them to demand the motion. So we present them with two sources of information, so shown here by collections of dots, one that's green, one that's blue. And at the first step of the task, we ask our monkey to choose which collection of dots do they want to observe. So in this example, the monkey makes a saccade to the green dots. When he makes a saccade, the green dots show their signal. So again, can be motion going upwards or downward, and only then the monkey can make the decision. And we focus on this sampling decision This is, we can take it to study neural activity. And to us, this is a microcosm of understanding information gathering. First of all, it is proactive. It requires the brain to estimate the information gain that might be obtained. And second, it can emulate all types of information demand. So in the situation that I've drawn here, our monkeys can take a decision based on the information that leads to reward. So this is a goal-directed type of information demand, or what we call instrumental information demand. But you can also set this task in a way in which the information that is gathered simply improves a prediction without allowing the animal to act and improve the reward. So that's our operational definition of curiosity, and we call this non-instrumental information demand. So, okay, so another huge advantage of having, of studying information demand in the context of attention is that we know quite a bit about the neural mechanisms, the network that might be involved. And that is a broad network that we call the attention executive control network. This network has at least two components that are best characterized now. One is the dorsal attention network, in particular the frontoparietal network shown here in orange that I'll be talking about most. And the other one is the dorsal anterior cingulate, which is a sort of monitoring network. And this is what Eliana Vicena spoke about yesterday. It interacts with dopamine and norepinephrine, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So most of our studies so far have been focused on this dorsal attention network, in particular the inferior parietal lobe. And we know a lot about this area from previous studies in monkeys. And what we know about it is that neurons in the IPL have visual receptive fields. So the neurons receive visual inputs. And when a neuron is active, it really speaks about a portion of the visual field. So you can think of them as a topographic representation of the environment. But their most interesting quality is that these neurons respond very selectively. So when in natural environments, they receive, a gazillion of visual inputs all the time, they're bombarded with information. By the time the information reaches the parietal cortex, most of it is filtered out. So the parietal area is mostly silent during natural viewing, but it responds very selectively to stimuli that somehow become attention worthy. So this is why we call this a priority map. It highlights one or a couple of stimuli in the environment. And the big open question that we have in this field, in our field, is that we don't know. We know that this selection happens. We just don't know how it happens. And that's what we are trying to figure out in the next. Okay. So going back to our hypothesis would be that the way in which the brain computes this visual priority should be related in some way to likelihood and uncertainty, if this is to provide a sort of optimal or near optimal Bayesian control. So in two experiments then, we set out to test those two variables, likelihood and uncertainty, one by one. So in the first experiment, we looked at likelihood, and we used the task that I've shown you before. And what we did is we gave the monkeys sources of information that differed in their likelihoods. And the monkeys were very familiar with each of these sources through a lot of extensive training. So for example, if the monkey chose to view the motion coming from this gray square, he would see motion that's high coherence and also has perfect likelihood, meaning that every time that the motion moves up, an upward saccade is correct and will lead to a reward. Every time motion moves down, a downward saccade would be correct and lead to a reward. But then we gave our monkeys also other sources of information that were less reliable. So for example, for an 80% validity stimulus, the motion would sometimes lie. So for example, the monkey would see motion upwards, but in fact, the correct response would be to look down. Okay, so the motion was simply wrong on a fraction of trials, randomly selected. So the monkey cannot predict which trial the motion is correct, which one it's wrong, but he knows the average validity by virtue of a lot of training. And we trained our monkeys with three sources of information that had 100%, 80%, and 55% validity. And then when we recorded neurons in the parietal cortex, again, we changed the geometry so that the high validity, we presented this stimuli in pairs, and we made it so that the high validity or the lower validity stimulus is in the receptive field of our cells. So we understand how the neurons weigh these sources. Okay, so what you can see from these responses is that the neurons always respond more to the higher validity stimulus. So here, if you have 100% with 55%, responses are higher for 100%, and so on for every one of these pairs. But you can also see that the difference between these responses scales with the relative validity, with the difference in the validity of the stimuli. So we can represent this like this. If you have a really good source with a really crappy source, there's a very big difference in their neural responses. But if you have a good, a perfect source and an 80% valid stimulus, then the difference in priority is a little less. This and other aspects of the data tell us that these stimuli compete with each other in proportion to validity. And I'll get back to this a little later. Okay, and then in a second experiment, we used a very similar task, except that now we looked at prior uncertainty. So here, we only presented our monkey with one source of information, 100% valid, but we presented it in two contexts that we ran as blocks of trials. So in one context, the monkey had prior uncertainty about which one of these targets would be correct. So when the monkey started a trial, either target was equally likely to be rewarded, and the monkey could anticipate that it would be only when he looks at the dots and triggers the motion that is what would resolve his decision uncertainty. In other blocks, however, we simply removed that prior uncertainty by keeping one of the targets constant. So, for example, starting a block, the monkey could anticipate that for the next 20 trials or so, it would always be the upper target. The monkey still had to look at the motion and trigger it. So getting the information had reward value, if you want, because it's necessary to get the reward in the task. But the monkey could anticipate that there is no information, that the information will be redundant. So there's no information gain by looking at the dots. And of course, the Bayesian logic would predict that the priority of that information source should be higher if there is prior uncertainty than if there is not. And indeed, this is what we saw in our LIP neurons. So when, here I'm looking at the period between when the monkey sees the display and is planning his eye movement. So again, before, when you just plan to demand information, you see that many of our neurons, over 40%, is a very reliable signal, have higher firing rates if the monkey has prior uncertainty than if he does not. This is an important observation for many reasons, but also because it clearly tells us that these priority responses are not some sort of value representation because the low uncertainty condition here is the easier one. So it requires less effort and it gets the monkeys higher success rates. And instead, the neurons are enhanced for the more difficult case. So we have a number of arguments that I don't have time to get into. This enhancement by uncertainty helps the monkey perform the post-saccadic discrimination, makes it more efficient. And we think that it encodes the cognitive efforts of the extra arousal required to resolve uncertainty and not the reward that the monkey expects for resolving that uncertainty. Okay, so at least we have some proof of concept that we are in the attention network and the neurons are sensitive to these key quantities of prior and likelihood. But as you will know, the important thing about Bayesian logic is that these two quantities have to be integrated in a very specific way, according to this formula. And in the formula, prior and likelihood are both probabilities. They're both apples, and you can add them, integrate them in a very straightforward manner. But in the brain, prior and likelihoods are apples and oranges, are two different entities. And it's really not obvious how the brain would put them together. So what do I mean by this? So I've shown you that likelihood is usually a property of a specific stimulus, a specific source of information, right? So when you walk down the street, for example, you know that the traffic light is a good predictor that has high likelihood for your current goal. So that property is attached to the traffic light. And as we've seen here, different sources of information compete in proportion to their likelihood on this spatially organized priority map. But uncertainty is more of a global brain state. It's like reward, it's a global signal. And we think that it's signaled by neuromodulators, which are transmitted all over the brain and do not have content-specific information. In the context of attention, we think that the way the network is put together, we think that the anterior cingulate, when it detects a need for control, possibly uncertainty, it calls for a boost of norepinephrine. So it projects down to this brainstem nucleus called the locus ceruleus, and it says, give me a boost of norepinephrine, locus ceruleus, outputs norepinephrine, and that is broadcast widely throughout the brain. And that produces enhancement in sensory gains and arousal and enhancement in learning rate and pupil dilation and a host of global changes. And so it's really, I think, a very interesting question how these specific and global signals are integrated with each other. Our working hypothesis now is that this integration is done through validity-based competition that is biased by an uncertainty signal. So, for example, as I've shown you before, you have these priority maps in which stimuli compete in proportion to their validity. And our hypothesis we're testing right now is that uncertainty biases the competition in favor of the best predictor, in favor of the highest validity stimulus. So for example, if you walk down the street and it's an open road and there's nobody there, you can let your mind wander a bit. You might be more distracted by stimuli that are less good predictors for you right now. But when you arrive at an intersection, there's a signal that says, hey, pay attention now, there's high uncertainty, and that will bias the competition towards the best predictor and really make sure that you are focused on what you need to focus at that point in time. So we have a bit of preliminary evidence that this is correct. But first, it's important to note that this sort of validity-based competition may lead to something that is not quite Bayesian optimal because it may lead to matching rather than maximizing behaviors, right? So here's the evidence that this is the case. So this comes from data from one monkey who was given a display like this, in which he had several sources that he could sample. Some were high validity and some were random, low validity. And again, the monkey understood the statistics by virtue of a lot of training. And here's the monkey's behavior, right? So you can see, and we did this in conditions of low and high prior uncertainty. So you can see that indeed, when the monkey has higher prior uncertainty, there is more of a bias towards the valid predictor. But what's interesting here is that this poor random predictor gets quite a bit of sampling, even when there is high uncertainty. And just for reference, here's the accuracy gains, the Bayesian accuracy gains. The random predictor has zero accuracy gain, right? So in fact, you only, so a strictly Bayesian model would only sample when there's maximum prior uncertainty and would only look at the good predictor, would never look at the random predictor. But you can see that our monkeys do look at the random predictors quite a bit. And that could arise by the fact that these predictors are never quite totally filtered out. They're just outcompeted by the other stimuli in the environment. Okay, so this is so we have a lot to learn about this mechanism, and we're working on it now. But I just want to make the point that by understanding biologically plausible mechanisms, we can start to make sense of some inefficiencies in information sampling that we start to see in various paradigms. And the other type of inefficiency that people, or apparent inefficiency that people are seeing quite a bit, is the fact that rewards can interfere with the reduction of uncertainty, right? So the interaction between rewards and uncertainty is, I think, a big deal and also a big open question. And rewards are really a double-edged sword because it's something that we can't live with them and we can't live without them. We cannot obviously live without rewards because rewards will tell us how to allocate our limited resources. So they're required in order to tell us what to inquire about, what is adaptive, right? On the other hand, it turns out that rewards also have some detrimental effects because the way that people and animals gather information is sensitive to the content or the reward associations of the information, right? So there's a lot of evidence that people and other animals prefer to view stimuli that are associated with rewards. They have so-called Pavlovian associations, even when these stimuli are not the most informative to the task. And what we were interested in whether these sort of reward associations can bias the competition for attentional resources. So what do I mean? So let me explain a little bit how these biases might come about. So imagine that you're trying to make a decision. It's a complex decision that has several attributes, such as buying a house, right? So there's several dimensions you could think about when you buy a house. So let's reduce it, for example, 2 dimensions, the quality of the roof and the color of the paint, right? So if you think about what contributes most to the value of the house, it would be reasonable to say, well, the quality of the roof will be more important than the color of the paint, right? So a value consideration would tell you, well, pay attention to the roof. But in fact, what should guide your attention should be how much you know about the roof and about the paint. If you already know everything there is to know about the roof, there is no reason for you to pay extra attention to it because you're not gaining any new information. But if you're uncertain about the paint, you should, of course, inquire about the paint. Even though it's tiny value, it has higher uncertainty for you. So this can set up a motivational conflict. What are you attending to? Are you attending to the roof because it has higher value, or are you attending to the paint because you know less about it? So this is the task that we set up to do, and we implemented this logic in a very simple lottery-based task in the laboratory. So the task was like this. People were shown 2 lotteries on each trial. So each lottery had a mean value, for example, 210 points or 300 points. And it also had a range of prizes that it could deliver. So for example, one lottery had a high variance, it could deliver prizes from a larger range, and one lottery had a smaller variance, it could deliver prizes from a small range around the mean. And the rules of the game were that the computer would select a random prize from each distribution, so one from the left and one from the right, and would add the 2 prizes and give them both to the participant at the end of the trial. So this was purely a game of chance, non-instrumental. But people were allowed to inquire about one of the prizes, right? So people were shown, okay, you're going to play 100 trials. At the end, we're going to select one of them and pay it out to you as a bonus. If you want to get a better idea of what you will get, you can reveal one of the prizes, either the prize here on the left or the prize on the right. Okay, so as you can see, if people are motivated to minimize their uncertainty about the sum that they will get, they should always inquire about the higher uncertainty prize, because that allows them to have the best prediction about the sum. And the value of this prize, whether it's lower value or higher value than the low uncertainty prize, should make no difference at all. The value does not matter at all. Attention should optimally simply go by the uncertainty of the prize. So we can plot the data like this. So we can show the relative value of the high uncertainty lottery. So here, positive values are when the high uncertainty has higher value than the low uncertainty lottery. Negative values are when the high uncertainty lottery has lower value than the high uncertainty lottery has lower value. And the fraction of time at which people should sample the high uncertainty lottery should be absolutely flat, right? Should not vary with expected reward, with the relative value. And this is what we found. These are psychometric functions. This is what we find in about 30% of people we tested. So by now we have a sample of about 600 people tested in the lab and online. And I find that about 30% of them behave as if in a way that can be explained by normative theories, meaning that they're not sensitive to relative value. You can see that many of these people tend to sample the high uncertainty lottery most often, meaning that they do seek to minimize their uncertainty. Other people are indifferent. They sample about 50-50, which is fine because there are no instrumental rewards here. And we have one person, which is interesting because he or she seems to seek to maximize their uncertainty. They always sample the lower variance lottery. But that's okay. All of these can be captured by some preference for resolution, but they can be captured by normative theory. But what is much harder to capture is the vast majority of people who are sensitive to value, meaning that people tend to sample so they will sample the high uncertainty lottery if it has the higher value. But if it has the lower value, people will sample the lower uncertainty, less informative lottery. Usually what we see is a mixture of sensitivity to relative value and a left or upward shift of this curve, which is there is a preference towards the high uncertainty lottery, but there is also a preference for value. So most people show both of these influences. And interestingly, we have new data that's coming in now that suggests that this behavior persists even when we make the task instrumental. In other words, even when we ask people to predict the sum and reward them for the accuracy of their prediction, they still make this, this mistake of sampling the high value lottery, even when it's not the most informative, and therefore they lose prediction accuracy and they actually lose rewards. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here and we can summarize. So this is where we are right now in neuroscience and psychology. We're finally starting to think about attention as a sort of rational choice that gathers information. And I think that studies of curiosity and information demand are very instructive for us. And it's a synergy that we can also hopefully contribute something to these studies. We are learning that a key theme is how the brain integrates uncertainty with likelihood and how that is done in a real network. And then we're learning that rewards, there's some big confusion in the brain between rewards and uncertainty, and rewards can also, I'm sure that sometimes they help, but they can also interfere with the reduction of uncertainty. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Yeah, Mark would like to ask a question.
Yes, fantastic talk, Jacqueline. This is really great. I have a question. Have you considered, and maybe I'll follow up with an explanation of what I mean here. Have you considered the effect of risk or risk-averse behavior in these experiments?
Yes. Yes, we have. And we looked at risk aversion, and we do not find any relation between information demand and risk seeking or risk aversion.
Okay.
It's quite an interesting question that I'm trying to pursue. We even did a formal comparison. So these experiments, so I'm sure you can see that mathematically, you can formalize how much you prefer to be informed or uninformed. It's exactly the same as how much you prefer to take a decision with certainty or risk, right? So we even ran a little experiment in which they're totally equated. Mathematically, there are two identical situations. But when you frame it as information demand or frame it as risk seeking, the parameters don't correlate. People do two different things.
That's interesting.
That is interesting, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I suppose we should follow up on this offline because I think I have some more thoughts for you. But for example, for the matching experiments, I think that the work we've done looking at risk suggests you might be able to explain matching, for example, as a risk-sensitive behavior.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to talk about this further because so this comparison of information and risk, we have it a bit on hold. I'm not exactly persuaded where we should take it, but if you have an idea, I'm open to that.
For sure. Well, I think for me, the starting point is that, risk-neutral behavior only makes sense for an organism in the limit of infinite trials, which is never really the case in most scenarios, right? So it makes sense to have risk baked into decision-making.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, then we have a question from the audience, Nina Suter, and she asked, was there a behavioral difference in the monkeys' engagement in tasks with and without prior uncertainty? So she asked, could it be that the easier task was more boring and they actually preferred the more uncertain task?
That is an interesting question. We didn't do a choice experiment. We now are trying to do something like a choice experiment. So we did not allow the monkey to say, do you want to perform this task that has high uncertainty that you can resolve, or this task that has no uncertainty that is brain dead and boring. We did not do that. We do know, so we think that the monkeys might choose the boring task if we did that. I mean, I don't know that I'd be totally surprised if they would choose the boring task because, well, it's easier and it gives them higher rate of rewards. So, so before I let them make that choice, I'd rather think about it a bit harder so that I don't get a totally null result. Yeah, I guess the short answer is no. We don't know. The one thing that we have though is that when the task promises a low reward, and we also manipulated the reward that we offered the monkeys. When the task promises a low reward and also has low uncertainty, the monkeys tend to disengage from the task, which means they break fixation, they abort the trial, right? So at the beginning, we tell them it's low uncertainty and it's low reward. And then we see that they often break fixation and do not complete the trial. And we're working now with Massimo Silvetti, who has a model of cognitive control. And the explanation to that seems to be that low uncertainty and low rewards just reduces the arousal level to the level that the system doesn't even engage in the task. And so, and we even think that in that case, the system, when the monkey performs the task, we see a little boost of activity. We see a little enhanced activity in the neurons. And that's when the monkey can perform the task. So if that activity is norepinephrine, that would be consistent with what the question is. So you'd say, if you're really so demotivated and you're so bored, you don't even do the task, the brain may enhance the norepinephrine, to wake you up so that you can engage. So in that sense, the monkeys might prefer higher uncertainty just to give them that extra arousal. But yeah, so that's for the future to see.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe another question from the audience, from Maya. Do you think neural uncertainty always correlates with a form of motor uncertainty, i.e. in your study, could the trajectory direction be the trajectory direction of the saccade? Or could it be that the motor uncertainty only appears after neural uncertainty surpasses a certain threshold?
Say that again.
Oh, yeah, maybe the first part is, so do you think neural uncertainty always correlates with a form of motor uncertainty?
Oh yeah, I can see it. The trajectory direction or motor uncertainty only appears after neural uncertainty surpasses a certain threshold. I don't know. I mean, neural uncertainty, so the first question, neural uncertainty doesn't always have to be motor uncertainty. I mean, you could have, you could see a blurry image and say, what's that? And I don't know. I mean, the question is a bit deep. Once you say, what is that? You're attempting a categorization, right? Is that X or is that Y? And one could argue that a categorization is a sort of action, is a mental action, because, categorization are immediately precursors of action. So, so in that sense, in a very deep sense, attending to uncertainty may always be in the context of trying to do something, either categorize it or take an action based on it. Now, the second question, I don't quite understand how that follows. Could it be that motor uncertainty only appears after neural uncertainty surpasses a certain threshold? I don't think that it's a matter of threshold or level. I think that it's more a matter of context. So, if you are interested to make a categorization, then you could have something like motor uncertainty come into play. If you are not interested, I mean, there's uncertainty about everything all the time, and we don't attempt to resolve that uncertainty. We don't attempt to make a categorization. So that kind of uncertainty, I don't quite know what happens. It may be represented in the brain, And maybe you can say, well, that's not translated into motor actions, but I don't quite know how I would examine those questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, I guess it also kind of draws in this, what is uncertainty and what is noise in the system, and how do you decide to act and when do you decide to act, right? So I agree on a deep level, there's a lot to unpack. So it's very cool.
There's a lot to unpack. I mean, there is, yeah. I mean, what happens to all the uncertainty that we don't care about?
Exactly, yeah.
That is a good thing, right.
Ilana has a question though, so we'll go for her.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the very nice talk. Unfortunately, I had to miss the beginning. But I had a couple of questions. So first of all, yeah, what do you think is the mechanism underlying this reward attraction that monkeys seem to have? So the last things you showed, is that like Pavlovian attentional capture or something? So is it interfering with what would be the rational choice? And kind of related also to those results. So I was wondering if you looked into the effect of how you present information on this effects that you measure, because we have done some work, for example, manipulating order in which people were seeing cues about reward and demand. And there we clearly saw that there was really was impact on performance, but also impact on decisions on what they would accept or not, just whether you presented first the difficulty of the task or the reward they would get for it. And we have a set of similar data when we did the same with probability and reward. So I was wondering whether you thought about that, the modality of presentation, how that impacts the decisions. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I did. So, okay, let me answer the first question first. So we have two hypotheses about these reward biases, what they might be. One is sort of a reactive hypothesis that just talks about that just talks about Pavlovian learning. So stimulus reward associations. If animals see a stimulus followed by reward, you can have a learning. If this happens very frequently, you can even increase the bottom-up drive of that reward-associated stimulus. And we see evidence of this in the parietal cortex. So that's one model, it's just bottom-up. But this can only produce a reactive orienting. So if you see the rewarding stimulus, you can orient to it. What we showed in that experiment with the two lotteries is, I think, a more sophisticated form of proactive seeking. The one model for this that exists right now is from Peter Dayan. And they talk about something that they call anticipatory utility. And the idea there is that a reward prediction error in itself is valuable. So Van Standard is a fairly non-standard reinforcement model in which the reward prediction error not only drives learning, it confers value to a state. And that value has a temporal profile. So it matters how long you get to anticipate the actual outcome. And there are two factors. So if the delay between when you start anticipating, when you start anticipating and when you get the outcome becomes longer, that can discount the outcome and reduce the value, but it could also increase the value if it gives you more time to savor it or anticipate it. So there's a nonlinear dependence on delay. That's the prediction. Not very strong tests of it right now, but it's an intriguing hypothesis about how that might arise. Okay, to your second question, I know your paper and we read it, and we tried to link it to what we did. So in our case, we didn't manipulate the order of presentation. We didn't do that, but we also, but what we have is a situation in which the monkey can anticipate a certain amount of uncertainty and anticipate a certain amount of reward. And we see that different monkeys, they seem to pay more attention to these two attributes. So we have one monkey whose behavior is changing based on uncertainty. He's really modulating his viewing time, his choices. So we reaction times based on uncertainty. And we have another monkey that's much more sensitive to reward, and he's modulating his his behavior in kind of weird ways based on reward, and he's less sensitive to uncertainty. And we see those differences in the parietal cortex. So some of the neurons in the first monkey are more sensitive to reward, to uncertainty. The neurons in the second monkey are more sensitive to rewards. So we've been trying to disentangle that. We looked at your paper. I don't know that it helps because I don't know what the order. So my feeling is that I don't know if it's the order so much as which attribute of the situation the person is attending to more.
Yeah.
Maybe what you did with the order manipulation is direct attention more to one or more to the other.
Yeah,
But,
that's right. That was a bit the assumption, right? Then
Yeah.
We didn't follow up on that, but the idea would be indeed that would apply to some spontaneous sampling. What we didn't really get to test that, so unfortunately. It's really interesting that you say that you see these individual differences. Basically, our sample was not large enough to test for that. It would be cool to try to use that as profiling index in these two.
I think that that's a very likely to be a very important thing. Individual sensitivity to uncertainty and reward, I think that will be a lot of variability, and that's really interesting to look at. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Thank you very much for the discussion. We are running 5 minutes late, so maybe we're running actually 10 minutes late. So let's have maybe a 15-minute break, and let's meet at 17:45 for Tom's talk.